Hi everyone, I am Shubham and today I will be presenting my work on understanding journalist workflow in news curation. Before I go deep into my work, I want to briefly highlight some trends that characterize online news consumption. At least in the United States, the internet is the largest source of news consumption ahead of TV and print media. Even on the internet, accessing news via intermediaries is becoming more and more popular. One form of intermediary is the social media platform. And as you can see in this chart, news access via social media has actually overtaken direct access to news via publisher websites. Another form of intermediary are news aggregators like Google News or Apple News. And as the second chart shows, Google News is actually ranked among the top 5 news websites in the United States, even though it does not publish any news stories of its own and only aggregates stories from other publishers. A third form of intermediary that is becoming more and more popular recently is newsletters that are curated by independent journalists. As some of you may already know, Substack is an independent publishing platform that allows journalists to run their own newsletters as well as monetize them through a subscription based model. As of November 2021, Substack had over a million paid subscribers with a total user base of over 10 million users. The reason why I have been focusing on these intermediaries so far is because they are becoming important gatekeepers of news that is published by other content producers, like the New York Times or the Reuters. And while we know a lot about algorithmic intermediaries like Google News and Twitter and how they curate their stories, we know very little about the gatekeeping process of individual journalists and how they select their stories. So, in this paper, we aim to fill that gap. And in particular, we wanted to address two main questions about the journalist gatekeeping process. First, how do journalists collect their news stories? And second, what factors guide the selection of their stories? To answer these questions, we conducted an in depth interview with journalists from around the world who curate their own newsletters by selecting stories from many different publishers. I would encourage you all to read our paper and find out more about the study design and the analysis. So, what did we find? The first step for collecting news stories for all journalists is to start with a small set of high recognition publishers, such as the New York Times or the Reuters. By regularly checking the websites of these major publishers, journalists can stay up to date on latest stories, and they can also rely on these publishers because they are known for their high editorial standards. However, checking out each and every publisher requires a considerable effort. So, a journalist can only do that for a handful of publishers. However, all journalists in our study also told us that the stories they curate in their newsletters come from hundreds of different publishers. And to give you some specific examples, how many of you have heard of ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, or the Hakai magazine, which specifically reports on coastal life and climate change, or Rest of World, with an explicit focus on tech news from non-Western contexts? And these are just three of the many such content producers who generally don't feature in mainstream news or social media platforms, but they have demonstrated expertise in their respective areas. Now, since it's not possible for a journalist to regularly visit the website of each and every such publisher, how do they curate their stories? Turns out, just like the rest of us, journalists also rely on other intermediaries. Specifically, they rely on aggregators like Google News, and for social media platforms, they rely on Twitter. The advantage with these intermediaries is that they collect their stories from thousands of publishers, so they can provide access to a much larger pool of stories compared to any one single publisher. Furthermore, an important characteristic is the algorithm behind them, the algorithm that sorts the content, so we see the most relevant stories first and we don't have to see all the content. However, by encoding its own logic of what is relevant and should be featured at the top, the algorithm also exhibits its own biases. For instance, one popular bias is the popularity bias. Stories that are already popular or stories about popular events are more likely to be ranked. And the research has found many other biases that are also present in algorithmic outputs. I would encourage you all to read the background section of our paper to learn more about the different kinds of algorithmic biases. Now, as journalists have to rely on these algorithms to curate their stories, they are actively conscious about not forcing these biases in their own selection of stories. In our study, we found that journalists, when selecting their own stories, actually put more emphasis on alternate values, such as the journalistic values of novelty, diversity, and serendipity. To keep this presentation short, I won't go into the details of how journalists realize these individual values, but I would encourage you all to read our paper and find out more about their approach. Another thing that we found is when selecting these stories, journalists' prior experience in the field come very handy. For example, consider this quote from one of our participants. The Institute for the Study of War is a much better source for understanding developments about the Russian campaign in Ukraine, more than anything you're going to read in the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, unless the Wall Street Journal story is written by Michael Gordon. This particular quote demonstrates how journalists have inside knowledge about the strengths and weaknesses of particular publishers and authors, and this allows them to proactively create content that is authoritative or credible rather than having to evaluate that retrospectively for each story that they come across. And lastly, journalists also have to account for their readers' interest when selecting their stories. However, unlike algorithms, all journalists in our study noted that they do not rely on explicit engagement data, such as user clicks or user likes, which are often used to train the algorithms. Furthermore, there is no personalization for individual readers as all readers receive the same set of stories. Instead, the journalists choose to focus on the broad interests of their readers. For example, the journalist repeatedly emphasized that they try to keep the newsletter short and simple so that it's an easy read for their readers. They try to make it a fun read by curating stories that are fun or humorous in some way, and sometimes they also try to add a voice so that it's a pleasant read for the readers. So to summarize all of this, what we found here through our study, which is actually happening in practice, is a working example of a hybrid curation between algorithms and journalists. Algorithms, on their part, bring scalability to the process. They allow journalists to access a very large pool of stories and find similar stories or find stories that provide a unique perspective. Journalists, on their part, bring their experience, their journalistic values, and provide a complete set of stories to their readers. This framing and the way we put this out goes beyond a binary narrative of either removing humans from the news consumption and solely relying on algorithms, or the other narrative, which is focusing too much on algorithmic biases and how they are degrading the quality of online news consumption. Instead, what we show and what we highlight through our findings are the complementary features of these two approaches, that is, using algorithms and using journalists, and the overall benefits of hybrid curation. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And I also wanted to give a shout out to my three collaborators, but especially Shruthi, who has been a journalist and whose insights have guided us through every step of the study. Thank you.